Jake Turner woke up before sunrise like he did every Saturday morning, and the cabin was quiet except for the sound of wind moving through the pine trees outside, and he made coffee in his old percolator and watched the darkness slowly turn to gray through the kitchen window. He had been living alone in the mountains for 3 years now after his divorce, and most people thought he was running away from his problems. But Jake knew he was running towards something better, and the peace he found here by Silver Creek was worth more than anything he left behind in the city. The fishing rod was already in his truck from last weekend, and he grabbed his tackle box and a thermos of coffee and drove down the dirt road toward his favorite spot. And the morning air was cold enough to see his breath, and he turned on the heater, even though it barely worked. Silver Creek was running high because of the late spring melt, and the water was clear and cold and perfect for trout. And Jake parked his truck under the big oak tree and walked down to the bank with his gear, and he was thinking about nothing except the rhythm of casting and the possibility of breakfast. That was when he saw something red in the water downstream, and at first, he thought it was a fallen branch or maybe some trash that washed down from the campground, and he almost ignored it, but something made him look closer, and his heart stopped when he realized it was moving with the current. Jake dropped his fishing rod and started running along the bank, and his boots slipped on wet rocks, but he kept going, and as he got closer, he saw it was a person, and they were floating face down and not moving, and 9 red tails spread out around them like ribbons of blood in the water. He did not think, and he did not hesitate, and he jumped into Silver Creek, and the cold hit him like a wall and knocked the air from his lungs, but he pushed through it and grabbed the person by the shoulder and turned them over, and almost let go in pure shock. It was a woman, but not like any woman he had ever seen, and her face was pale and perfect, with high cheekbones and full lips that were turning blue, and on top of her head were 2 red fox ears that lay flat against her skull, and her skin had strange silver markings that looked like they were glowing faintly. Even in the weak morning light, Jake shook off his shock and dragged her toward the shore, and she was heavier than she looked, and the current fought him for every inch, and by the time he got her onto the muddy bank, he was exhausted and shaking from the cold. But he knew he had to move fast. She was not breathing, and her lips were blue, and her skin felt like ice. And Jake tilted her head back and checked her airway and then started chest compressions like he learned in that safety course the Forest Service made him take 5 years ago. He counted out loud as he pushed down on her chest, and he did not know if human CPR would work on whatever she was, but it was all he knew how to do. And after 30 compressions, he pinched her nose and gave her 2 rescue breaths and then went back to compressions. Water came up from her mouth and nose, and Jake turned her on her side and she coughed, and more water came out, and then she gasped and her eyes opened wide, and they were golden like honey in sunlight, and they fixed on Jake with an expression of pure terror. She tried to scramble away from him, and her 9 tails thrashed in the mud, and she made sounds that were not quite words, and Jake held up both hands to show he meant no harm, and he said his name slowly and clearly. The woman stopped moving and stared at him, and her chest heaved as she tried to breathe, and Jake could see she was hurt because blood was seeping from cuts on her arms and legs, and there was a deep gash on her side that looked bad. He pointed to himself and said his name again, and then pointed to her, and waited, and she tilted her head like she was listening to something he could not hear, and then she spoke, and her voice was musical and strange, and the words made no sense. But then something changed, and she blinked and focused on him and said her name, and it sounded like Kira, and her accent was thick, but the words were English, and Jake asked if she was okay, and she looked down at her wounds and said something that sounded like no. Jake told her he had a cabin nearby and medical supplies, and she needed help, and Kira looked at him for a long moment like she was trying to decide if she could trust him, and then she nodded and tried to stand, but her legs gave out and she fell. He caught her before she hit the ground, and she was lighter than he expected, despite her height, and he carefully picked her up, and she did not fight him, and her 9 tails wrapped around his arms like they had minds of their own. The walk back to his truck felt like it took forever, and Kira was shivering against his chest and mumbling words in her own language, and Jake kept talking to her to keep her conscious, and he told her she was going to be okay, even though he had no idea if that was true. When they reached the truck, he opened the passenger door and carefully set her down on the seat, and she leaned against the window and closed her eyes, and Jake ran around to the driver's side and started the engine, and turned the heat up as high as it would go. The drive back to the cabin only took 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. And Jake kept glancing over at Kira to make sure she was still breathing and her skin was starting to get some color back. But those wounds looked worse in the light. He parked as close to the front door as he could and carried her inside and laid her on his couch, and she opened her eyes and looked around his small cabin and then back at him. And she said thank you in perfect English with barely any accent at all. Jake asked how she learned English so fast, and Kira touched her temple and said her people could absorb languages from those around them, and it was a survival trait from when her species was prey instead of predators. And Jake did not understand, but he nodded anyway. He went to get his first aid kit, and when he came back, Kira was trying to take off her torn clothing to see her wounds better, and Jake helped her and tried not to stare at her strange and beautiful body, and the way her tails moved with her emotions. The cuts on her arms and legs were not deep, and he cleaned them with antiseptic and bandaged them, but the gash on her side was bad and still bleeding, and Jake said she might need a hospital, and Kira grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and said, "No hospitals." She told him her body would heal itself faster than humans and she just needed time and rest and food, and Jake wanted to argue, but something in her golden eyes made him trust her, and he nodded and did his best to clean and bandage the wound. When he was done, Kira lay back on the couch, and her 9 tails wrapped around her body like a blanket, and she looked at Jake and said she owed him a life debt, and where she came from, that meant everything. Jake made soup from a can and heated it on his old stove, while Kira slept on his couch, and he kept checking on her every few minutes to make sure she was still breathing, and her color was definitely better now, and the wounds seemed to be closing faster than should be possible. When she woke up, the sun was high in the sky and streaming through the windows, and Kira sat up slowly and touched the bandage on her side and looked surprised that it was there, and Jake brought her the soup, and she sniffed it carefully before taking a small sip. She said it was good, even though Jake knew it was just cheap chicken noodle soup and nothing special, and Kira ate the whole bowl slowly and deliberately, like she was savoring every bite. And when she was done, she looked at Jake and said she needed to tell him something important. Jake sat in the chair across from her and waited, and Kira took a deep breath and said she was not from this world, and her people came from a planet called Ashira in a system far from here, and her ship had crashed in these mountains 3 days ago. He wanted to laugh because it sounded like something from a science fiction movie, but then he looked at her 9 tails and her fox ears and those golden eyes, and he knew she was telling the truth, and he asked what happened and why she crashed. Kira said her ship was damaged in a battle, and she barely escaped before it exploded, and she managed to activate the emergency landing protocol. But something went wrong, and she crashed into the mountain, and she was the only survivor. Jake asked about the others, and Kira's face fell and her tails drooped, and she said there were 12 people on her ship, including her mate and their unborn child, and they were all gone now, and she was alone in a strange world with enemies hunting her. She explained that the same enemy that destroyed her ship was coming to Earth, and they were called the Devourers, and they consumed entire civilizations and took everything of value and left nothing behind but dead, empty planets. Jake felt cold despite the warm cabin, and he asked when they would arrive, and Kira said soon, and maybe days or maybe weeks. But they were coming, and Earth had no defenses that could stop them, and billions of people would die or be taken as slaves. He asked why they were chasing her, and Kira hesitated, and then reached into a hidden pocket in her torn clothing and pulled out a small silver egg about the size of a baseball, and it was warm and seemed to pulse with its own light. She said this was her son and that her people were dragon riders and their dragons were born from eggs like this, and the Devourers wanted it because dragons were powerful and rare and could turn the tide of any battle. Jake stared at the egg and asked if it was alive, and Kira nodded and said yes, and he was waiting to hatch, and he would know her as his mother and bond with her forever, and dragons lived for thousands of years and were loyal until death. She said the Devourers had been hunting her specifically because they detected the egg's energy signature, and they would not stop until they had it, or until she was dead, and she had been running and hiding for 3 days straight without sleep or food. Jake asked why she was in the river, and Kira said she was being chased by their scouts, and she jumped into the water to hide her thermal signature, and the current was stronger than she expected, and she hit her head on a rock, and that was the last thing she remembered. He realized that if he had not been there at exactly that moment, she would have drowned and the egg would have been lost forever. And Kira seemed to realize the same thing, and she looked at him with those golden eyes and said the universe worked in mysterious ways. Jake got up and paced around his small cabin and tried to process everything she told him, and part of him wanted to call someone or drive to town and get help. But another part of him knew that no one would believe this and Kira would end up in some government lab. She watched him pace and said she understood if he wanted her to leave and she would not blame him because this was not his fight, and he had already saved her life and owed her nothing. But Jake stopped pacing and looked at her and said she was hurt and being hunted, and he was not the kind of person who turned away someone who needed help. And his ex-wife always said he had a savior complex, but maybe that was not such a bad thing. Kira's eyes got shiny like she might cry, and she said she had only known humans through her people's data files, and those files said humans were primitive and violent and selfish. But Jake was none of those things. And maybe the files were wrong. Jake asked what they should do, and Kira said she needed to reach her crashed ship and retrieve something important, and if they could do that, she might have a way to stop the Devourers, or at least slow them down. He asked where the ship was, and Kira closed her eyes and seemed to concentrate and then pointed northwest and said it was in the mountains, about 30 miles from here, in a deep valley that was hard to reach. Jake said his truck could not make it that far off road, and Kira said they would need to hike and it would take at least 2 days, and she was not sure if she was strong enough yet. But they had to try because time was running out. He looked outside at the afternoon sun and said they should wait until morning so she could rest more and they could pack supplies, and Kira agreed, even though he could see she wanted to leave immediately. That night Jake made dinner and they ate together, and Kira told him about her world and her people and the war that destroyed everything she knew. And Jake listened and tried to imagine a civilization that could travel between stars. She asked about Earth, and Jake told her about his life and his divorce and why he came to the mountains, and Kira said that seeking peace after pain was a sign of wisdom, and her people had a saying that translated to still water runs deep. When it was time to sleep, Jake offered her his bed, but Kira said the couch was more comfortable than anywhere she had slept in days, and she curled up with her tails wrapped around her and the egg held close to her chest. Jake lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about everything that happened and wondered if he was making a huge mistake. But then he remembered Kira's face when she talked about losing her mate and child, and he knew he had to help her. Somewhere in the night, he heard a sound like wind chimes, and he got up and looked in the living room and saw that the egg was glowing brighter. And Kira was awake and singing something soft in her own language. She looked up at Jake and smiled and said her son could feel that they were safe now, and he was growing stronger, and soon he would hatch, and Jake would meet the first dragon born on Earth in millions of years. Jake sat down next to her and asked what they would do after they stopped the Devourers, and Kira was quiet for a long time, and then said she did not know, because she had no home to return to, and nowhere to go. He told her she could stay here as long as she wanted, and Kira looked at him with surprise and asked why he would offer that, and Jake shrugged and said, because everyone deserves a place to belong, and she saved his world before it even knew it needed saving. They left before dawn with backpacks full of supplies, and Jake carried his hunting rifle, even though Kira said it probably would not hurt the Devourers, but it made him feel better to have it, and Kira moved through the forest like she was born, there despite her injuries. The mountain trail was steep and rocky, and Jake was breathing hard after the first hour. But Kira barely seemed winded, and she had to stop and wait for him several times, and she never complained or made him feel bad about being slower. She told him that her people evolved on a world with higher gravity and thinner air, and so Earth felt easy to her, like everything weighed less and moved slower, and Jake said that must be nice. And she laughed, and it sounded like bells around. Noon they stopped by a stream to rest and eat, and Jake noticed that Kira's wounds were almost completely healed, and only faint silver scars remained, and she saw him looking and said, her people healed fast because they used to be prey animals. Millions of years ago, he asked what hunted them, and Kira said great flying beasts that could swallow a person whole, and her ancestors learned to heal quickly or die, and eventually they became smart enough to fight back, and then they found the dragons and everything changed. Jake asked how her people found dragons, and Kira said the dragons found them actually, and it happened during a great war when her people were dying, and the dragons appeared and offered a bond, and together they drove the predators to extinction. She said dragons were older than her people, and older than most civilizations in the galaxy, and they chose who they bonded with, and once bonded, the connection lasted forever, and a dragon could feel their rider's emotions from across the universe. The egg in her pack glowed softly, and Kira took it out and held it close and whispered to it in her language. And Jake asked if the baby dragon could hear her, and she said yes. And he was dreaming of flying and hunting and meeting his mother. They walked for hours more, and the terrain got rougher, and Jake's legs burned and his lungs ached, but he kept going because Kira needed to reach that ship, and he was not going to be the reason they failed as the sun started to set. They reached a ridge, and Kira pointed down into a valley below, and Jake saw twisted metal scattered among the trees and a long scar in the earth where something had crashed and burned. The main part of the ship was buried in the side of the mountain, and it was smaller than Jake expected and shaped like a teardrop, and the hull was black and covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift when he looked at them. Directly, Kira's face was tight with pain and grief, and Jake realized she was looking at the place where everyone she loved had died, and he touched her shoulder gently and said, "They did not have to do this right now, and they could camp here and go down in the morning." But Kira shook her head and said the devourers were getting closer, and she could feel them like pressure in her skull, and they needed to move fast, and she started down the steep slope toward the wreckage. Jake followed carefully and tried not to slip on loose rocks, and by the time they reached the valley floor, it was almost dark, and Kira was already at the ship pulling away debris and twisted metal with her bare hands. He helped her clear the entrance, and Kira pried open a hatch that looked sealed shut, and inside was darkness and the smell of burned plastic and something else that Jake could not identify. Kira climbed inside, and Jake followed with his flashlight, and the interior was a mess with collapsed walls and sparking wires and broken equipment everywhere, and Jake saw dark stains on the floor that might have been blood. She moved through the wreckage like she knew exactly where she was going, and Jake followed her deeper into the ship, and they passed what looked like sleeping quarters and a small kitchen, and then they reached a door that was sealed with a glowing keypad. Kira pressed her hand against the pad, and it scanned her, and the door opened with a hiss, and inside was a small room with walls covered in strange crystalline structures that pulsed with soft blue light. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it was a small device that looked like a silver sphere covered in intricate patterns, and Kira picked it up carefully and held it like it was the most precious thing in the universe. Jake asked what it was, and Kira said it was a quantum communicator, and it could send messages across the galaxy instantly, and she could use it to contact what remained of her people's fleet and maybe get help. But then her face fell, and she said the fleet was scattered and broken, and most of her people were dead or enslaved, and even if she sent a message, it might be weeks or months before anyone could come, and Earth did not have that much time. Jake asked if there was anything else in the ship they could use, and Kira said most of the weapons were destroyed in the crash and the power core was damaged beyond repair, and this communicator was the only thing that still worked. They left the ship and made camp in the trees nearby, and Jake built a small fire, and they ate energy bars from his pack, and Kira held the egg close to the fire and sang to it softly. That night, Jake woke to the sound of something moving in the darkness, and he grabbed his rifle and sat up and saw Kira standing at the edge of their camp, staring up at the sky with her tails bristling. He asked what was wrong, and she pointed up, and Jake looked and saw 3 bright lights moving across the stars, and they were too fast to be planes and too low to be satellites. Kira said those were Devourer scout ships, and they were scanning the area and looking for her energy signature, and they needed to move now before the scouts found them. Jake kicked dirt over the fire and grabbed his pack, and they ran through the dark forest, and branches whipped at Jake's face, and he stumbled over roots, but Kira pulled him along with surprising strength. They ran for what felt like hours, and Jake's lungs were burning and his legs felt like rubber, but Kira did not slow down. And finally, they reached a cave hidden behind a waterfall, and she pulled him inside. The cave was deep and dark, and the sound of falling water covered any noise they made, and Kira said they should be safe here for a while because the water would hide their thermal signatures. Jake collapsed on the rocky floor and tried to catch his breath, and Kira sat next to him and checked the egg and said he was okay, and still growing strong, and Jake asked how long until he hatched. She said soon, and maybe tomorrow, or the next day, and when he did, they would need to be somewhere safe because newborn dragons were vulnerable and needed food and protection. Jake asked what dragons ate, and Kira smiled and said meat and lots of it, and they grew fast in the first Few days, and her son would be the size of a horse within a week. He tried to imagine a dragon the size of a horse and failed, and Kira laughed at his expression and said, Jake would get used to it, and dragons were intelligent and gentle with those they loved. Outside the cave, the lights continued to sweep across the valley, and Jake knew the devourers were getting closer, and time was running out, and he asked Kira what their plan was. She was quiet for a long time and then said she had been thinking about the old ways and how her ancestors fought before they had advanced technology, and sometimes the simplest solutions were the best. Kira said she would challenge the devourer leader to single combat for the fate of Earth, and it was an ancient law that all species in the galaxy respected, and if she won, they would have to leave. Jake said that sounded insane and dangerous, and Kira smiled sadly and said yes. But it was the only chance Earth had, and she would not let another world die because she was too afraid to fight. Morning came slowly in the cave, and Jake woke to find Kira sitting cross-legged with the egg in her lap, and her eyes closed and her lips moving in silent prayer or meditation. And the egg was glowing brighter than before, and he could see cracks forming on its surface. He sat up quietly and watched as the cracks spread and pieces of silver shell fell away, and something inside moved and pushed against the remaining shell. And then, with a sound like breaking glass, the egg split open completely. Small dragon emerged wet and shaking, and its scales were silver like the egg, and its eyes were bright blue like the sky. And it made a sound that was part chirp and part roar, and looked around with wonder and confusion. Kira made a soft cooing sound, and the dragon turned to her, and their eyes met, and Jake saw something pass between them, and he knew the bond was forming, and the dragon climbed onto her lap and nuzzled against her chest. She looked at Jake with tears running down her face and said his name was Storm because he would be strong and fierce like the weather, and he would protect those who could not protect themselves. Storm turned his head and looked at Jake, and the dragon's blue eyes seemed to look right through him, and then Storm made that wind chime sound and walked over to Jake on unsteady legs and nuzzled against his hand. Kira said Storm was accepting Jake as family, and that was rare because dragons were usually wary of strangers, but Storm could feel Jake's heart and knew he was good and trustworthy. Jake carefully petted Storm's head, and the scales were warm and smooth like polished metal, and Storm purred like a giant cat. And Jake laughed because it was the strangest and most wonderful thing that had ever happened to him. Kira said they needed to feed Storm soon because newborn dragons were always hungry, and they needed meat to grow strong. And Jake said he saw deer tracks near the cave entrance, and he could try to hunt one. But before he could move, Storm's head snapped toward the cave entrance and his scales bristled, and he made a low growling sound, and Kira grabbed her weapon and said someone was coming. Jake picked up his rifle and they moved deeper into the cave, and Storm stayed between them and the entrance, and despite being only minutes old, he looked ready to fight. 3 figures appeared at the cave entrance, and they were tall and covered in black armor, and their faces were hidden behind helmets, and they carried weapons that glowed with purple energy. Kira said something in a language Jake did not understand, and one of the figures responded, and its voice was cold and mechanical, and it demanded that Kira surrender the dragon and come peacefully. She said she would never surrender, and the figure said then she would die, and the other 2 raised their weapons, and Jake did not think he just fired his rifle. The bullet hit the first figure in the chest, and it stumbled back but did not fall, and Jake realized the armor was too strong and his gun was useless. But his shot gave Kira time to move, and she was faster than anything Jake had ever seen, and she closed the distance in a blink, and her blade cut through the figure's armor like it was paper. The other 2 figures fired their weapons, and purple energy beams lit up the cave, and Jake dove behind a rock and felt the heat as the beams passed over him. Storm roared, and flames erupted from his mouth, and one of the figures screamed as fire engulfed them, and their armor melted and they fell. And the smell of burning filled the cave. Kira fought the last figure hand to hand, and they were evenly matched, and Jake could only watch as they moved too fast for him to follow. And finally Kira's blade found a gap in the armor, and the figure fell. The cave was silent except for the sound of their breathing and the waterfall outside, and Kira checked each figure to make sure they were dead, and then she turned to Storm and examined him carefully. Said he should not have been able to breathe fire yet because dragons usually needed days or weeks to develop that ability. But Storm was special, and the bond between them was stronger than normal. Jake asked if more would come, And Kira said yes, and many more. And they needed to leave now and find somewhere they could make their stand. They gathered their things and left the cave, and Storm followed them on wobbly legs, but he was already getting stronger and steadier. And by the time they reached the forest floor, he was walking normally. Kira used the communicator to send a message into space, and she said she was challenging the Devourer leader to combat, and the terms were simple. And if she won, they would leave Earth forever, and if she lost, Earth would belong to them. Jake said that seemed like a bad deal because if she lost, humanity would be enslaved. But Kira said they were going to take Earth anyway, and at least this way there was a chance. She said the challenge would be answered soon because the Devourers respected strength, and they would not refuse a formal combat challenge. And the fight would happen somewhere public, so everyone could witness the outcome. They hiked back toward Jake's cabin, and Storm grew larger with each passing hour, and by the time the sun was setting, he was the size of a large dog, and his wings were starting to develop. Jake's phone had no signal this deep in the mountains, but when they got closer to civilization, he turned it on and saw dozens of missed calls and emergency alerts. The alerts said that strange ships had appeared over major cities around the world, and people were being taken and governments were trying to respond, but their weapons had no effect. Kira looked at the phone and her face was grim, and she said it had begun and the Devourers were already harvesting Earth, and they were running out of time. When they reached the cabin, Jake turned on his old television, and every channel showed the same thing, which was massive black ships hovering over cities and smaller craft descending to take people and resources. The news anchors were trying to stay calm, but Jake could hear the fear in their voices, and some channels had already gone dark and been replaced with emergency broadcasts. Kira said the Devourer leader would respond to her challenge within hours, and the fight would probably happen tomorrow, and she needed to prepare. She asked Jake if he had a place nearby that was open and flat, and Jake said there was a dry lake bed about 20 miles south in the desert, and Kira said that would work. Storm was now the size of a pony, and his scales gleamed in the lamplight, and his wings were large enough to spread, and Kira said he would be able to fly soon and carry both of them. Jake asked if she really thought she could win, and Kira was quiet and then said she did not know, but she had to try because the alternative was unacceptable. She spent the night sharpening her blade and checking her armor and meditating with Storm, and Jake cleaned his rifle, even though he knew it was useless, and tried to think of ways he could help. Before dawn, Kira's communicator lit up with a message, and she read it and nodded and said the challenge was accepted and the fight would happen at noon today at coordinates that matched the dry lake bed. Jake asked what would happen to Storm if she lost, and Kira said Storm would return to the egg and wait for another rider, because dragons could not survive without the bond. She made Jake promise that if she died, he would take Storm's egg somewhere safe and hide it where the Devourers could never find it. And Jake said he would, but he also said she was not going to lose. Kira smiled and said she liked his optimism, and that humans had something her people lost long ago, which was hope, even in the darkest moments. Storm had grown even more overnight, and was now the size of a horse, and his wings were strong enough to lift him, and Kira said it was time to go. They walked outside, and Kira climbed onto Storm's back and reached down to help Jake up, and he had never ridden a dragon before and did not know what to expect. Storm's scales were warm against his legs, and when the dragon spread his wings, they blocked out the stars, and then with a powerful leap they were in the air. And Jake held on tight and tried not to scream. Flying was nothing like Jake imagined, and the wind was cold and strong, and the world below looked small and distant, and Storm moved through the air like he was born to it. The dry lake bed stretched out below them, flat and empty and perfect for a battle, and Kira directed Storm to land in the center, and the dragon touched down smoothly despite his young age. Jake climbed off Storm's back, and his legs were shaking from the flight and the fear of what was coming, and Kira stood next to him and placed a hand on his shoulder and said she was grateful to have met him. He told her not to talk like she was going to die, and she smiled and said she was just being realistic, but she would fight with everything she had because Earth deserved a chance. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and they waited in silence, except for Storm, who paced back and forth and occasionally spread his wings and made small practice flights. At exactly noon, a shadow fell over the lake bed, and Jake looked up and saw a massive ship descending, and it was 10 times bigger than Kira's crashed vessel and covered in weapons and armor. The ship landed on the far side of the lake bed, and a ramp extended, and a figure walked out. And it was at least 8 feet tall and covered in black and red armor, and carried a weapon that looked like a spear, crossed with a sword. Kira whispered that this was Commander Vex, and he was the leader of this devourer fleet, and he had destroyed more worlds than she could count, and he had never lost a challenge. Combat Jake asked if she was sure about this, and Kira said no, but she was doing it anyway. And she climbed onto Storm's back, and the dragon roared and flames shot into the sky. Commander Vex raised his weapon in salute, and his voice boomed across the lake bed, and he said he respected Kira's courage, but she would fall like all the others. Before her, Kira said nothing, and Storm launched into the air, and the battle began, and Jake could only watch as Dragon and Rider faced an enemy that had conquered countless worlds. Vex's ship rose to meet them, and weapons fired and purple energy beams cut through the air, and Storm dodged and weaved, and his movements were graceful despite being so young. Kira guided Storm in close, and the dragon breathed fire, and the flames washed over the ship's hull. But the armor held, and Vex laughed and said her pet was impressive but not enough. The ship fired again, and this time the beam caught Storm's wing, and the dragon roared in pain and faltered, and Jake's heart stopped as they started to fall. But Kira pulled Storm out of the dive, and the dragon recovered and flew higher, and Jake realized she was using the sun to blind the ship's sensors. Storm dove from above, and his claws raked across the ship's hull, and metal shrieked and tore, and the ship wobbled, but stayed in the air. Vex emerged from a hatch on top of the ship, and he jumped across the gap and landed on Storm's back behind Kira, and Jake screamed a warning, but it was too late. The two warriors fought on Storm's back, while the dragon tried to stay stable, and their blades clashed and sparked and moved so fast Jake could barely see them. Kira was skilled, but Vex was stronger, and he drove her back toward Storm's tail, and she was running out of room, and Jake saw her glance down at the ground far below. Then Kira did something unexpected, and she dropped her blade and grabbed Vex's arm and pulled him close and whispered something Jake could not hear. Vex hesitated for just a moment, and in that moment Storm rolled in the air, and Vex lost his balance, and Kira pushed him, and he fell. But Vex grabbed her arm as he fell and pulled her with him, and they both tumbled through the air, and Jake watched in horror as they plummeted toward the ground. Storm dove after them faster than Jake thought possible, and the dragon caught Kira in his claws, but Vex hit the ground hard, and his armor cracked and split. Jake ran across the lake bed, and Storm landed and placed Kira gently on the ground, and she was hurt, but alive, and her armor had protected her from Storm's claws. Vex tried to stand, but his legs were broken, and his armor was failing, and he looked up at Kira and said she fought with honor, and he had not expected that from one so young. Kira stood over him with her blade at his throat, and she could end it with one strike. And Jake held his breath and waited, but Kira lowered her blade and said she offered mercy if his fleet would leave Earth and never return. And Vex stared at her in shock, because devourers never showed mercy, and never expected it. He asked why she would spare him, and Kira said, because killing him would change nothing, but sparing him might change everything. And maybe it was time for the devourers to remember what honor meant. Vex was silent for a long time, and then he activated his communicator and ordered his fleet to withdraw from Earth and to mark this world as protected under the ancient combat laws. The massive ship lifted off, and other ships appeared in the sky above major cities, and they all turned and flew away and disappeared into space. Jake ran to Kira and helped her stand, and she leaned against him, and Storm nuzzled them both, and the dragon made that wind chime sound that meant happiness and relief. News helicopters appeared overhead and started filming, and Jake knew the whole world had just watched a woman and her dragon save humanity from slavery and extinction. Kira looked exhausted and hurt, but she smiled and said they did it and Earth was safe. And Jake said no, she did it, and he just came along for the ride. Storm grew larger over the next few days, and by the end of the week he was the size of a small house and could carry both Kira and Jake with ease. The world wanted to meet Kira and thank her and make her a hero, but she refused all interviews and public appearances and said she just wanted to be left alone. Jake offered her his cabin again and said she could stay as long as she wanted, and Kira accepted and said she had nowhere else to go and no one else to be with. They settled into a routine, and Kira would fly Storm over the mountains every day, and Jake would fish in Silver Creek, and sometimes she would join him and they would talk about everything and nothing. People left them alone after a while, and the world moved on and rebuilt, and the governments tried to prepare for the next time something from space came to Earth. Kira said the Devourers would honor the combat agreement because they had to, or they would lose all credibility with the other species in the galaxy. Jake asked what she would do now, and Kira said she did not know, but she thought maybe she would protect Earth because someone needed to, and she had nothing better to do. Storm became the guardian of the skies and would patrol the atmosphere and watch for threats, and fighter jets would sometimes fly with him. And the pilots said it was the greatest honor of their lives. Kira trained human pilots in aerial combat and shared some of her technology, and Earth's defenses grew stronger, and people felt safer knowing she was watching over them. Sometimes Jake would sit on his porch and watch Kira and Storm fly overhead, and he would remember that morning at Silver Creek when he pulled a dying woman from the water. He never regretted jumping in, and he never regretted helping her. And Kira said she owed him more than a life debt, and she owed him her future. Jake said she did not owe him anything, and they were friends, and that was enough. And Kira smiled and said humans really were special. Years passed, and Storm grew to the size of a mountain, and his roar could be heard from miles away, and children grew up knowing they were safe, because a dragon watched over them. Kira aged slowly because her people lived longer than humans, and she knew she would watch Jake grow old and die. But she said it was worth it because the time they had was precious. Jake said he was lucky to have met her, and Kira said no. She was lucky to have met him because he reminded her that the universe was worth saving. On quiet mornings, Jake still went fishing at Silver Creek, and sometimes Kira would join him, and they would sit in comfortable silence and watch the water flow. She told him once that she had traveled across the galaxy and seen wonders beyond imagination. But nothing compared to the simple peace of a mountain stream at sunrise. Jake asked if she missed her home, and Kira said yes, but Earth was her home now, and the people here were her people, and she would protect them until her last breath. Storm would land nearby and watch over them and occasionally catch fish in his massive jaws, and Kira would laugh and scold him gently for showing off. The universe was vast and full of dangers, but Earth had a protector who asked for nothing in return except friendship and a place to belong. And in a small cabin in the mountains, a fisherman and a warrior from the stars lived quietly and happily, and proved that sometimes the most important moments in history start with one person choosing to help another. Jake never thought he was special or brave, but Kira said that jumping into a freezing river to save a stranger was the definition of both. And when people asked him how he saved the world, Jake would smile and say he did not save the world. He just pulled someone from a river and she did the rest. But Kira would shake her head and say Jake saved her first, and everything that came after was only possible because he chose kindness over fear. The story spread across Earth and then across the galaxy, and other species learned about the human who saved a dragon rider and changed the fate of a world. And somewhere in the darkness of space, the Devourers remembered the warrior who showed them mercy, and they wondered if maybe there was a better way to exist in the universe.